Well, I think we'll get started. It's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Ann McNichol to ESS today. Ann is a senior research specialist in the Department of Geology and Geophysics at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. Ann earned her BS in chemistry from Trinity College and her PhD in chemical oceanography from the WHOI-MIT Joint Program.
Yay!
Ann is the expert in the field of carbon isotopes. She has studied the carbon cycle of the great oceans and down to individual molecules in small plants from tiny marshes. Today, Ann will present her work entitled Carbon Isotopes in the Ocean, a summary of the WOCE, CLIVAR, and GOSHIP programs. Ann, welcome.
Thank you, Ellen. Very nice introduction. And Ellen has neglected to say that she was one of the co-thesis advisors, thesis chairs for my thesis when I was at Woods Hole. I hope I will show that I've done well by her. But anyway, the programs I'm going to talk about are the WOCE, CLIVAR, GOSHIP programs, which I will define on the next slide. This work represents a huge amount of work over 3 decades by many, many people, the most important of whom are listed by name in this title slide. And I've put NOSAMs down there because the measurements I'm going to be talking about were all, except the radiocarbon measurements, were all measured at NOSAMs, the National Ocean Sciences Accelerator Mass Spectrometry Facility based at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. I guess I'm a founding member of it, and it was started primarily to serve the WOCE radiocarbon program. What else was I going to say? It's funded by NSF. There's been some other funding from WHOI and from NOAA, but primarily by NSF. How do I guess I can, so the programs I'm talking about are WOCE, the World Ocean Circulation Experiment, which was conducted in the 1990s, and its goal was to establish the role of the world ocean in the Earth's climate system. CLIVAR was an add-on after WOCE. It collected samples from 2000 to 2010, and its goal was to understand the climate variability and predictability on seasonal to centennial timescales and identify processes responsible for climate change and develop predictive capabilities. We're currently receiving samples from GOSHIP, the Global Ocean Ship-Based Hydrographic Investigations Program, which has been going from the 2010s till recently and has been refunded so that these programs will result in 4 decades of oceanographic measurements. I'm primarily focused on radiocarbon, but there's a huge amount of, there's temperature, salinity, oxygen, nutrients, helium, tritium, all sorts of measurements that are being made as part of this program. These are global programs, so of course I have to introduce the global carbon cycle, which I'm sure you are all very familiar with. I put the medium that I'm going to be presenting results from in this paper, in this talk, in the red box. I'm looking at the dissolved inorganic carbon in the ocean water from the surface down to depth. And you can see that the deep water DIC is a huge reservoir of carbon. It's impacted by atmospheric interactions. Basically, CO2 gets into the ocean primarily from interactions with the surface water, although there is input from rivers, volcanism, and to the atmosphere, fossil fuel combustion. Let's see. Since the Industrial Revolution, the impact of humans can be seen in the carbon isotope signature of dissolved inorganic carbon. And when I talk about DIC, dissolved inorganic carbon, I'm talking about the total carbon pool in the oceans. So CO2 from the atmosphere is dissolved and then becomes a part of the inorganic carbon cycle. And what we measure is the totality of this. We strip it out as CO2 gas. One of the things that's important in looking at the modern ocean carbon cycle is the Zeus effect. Prior to human activities, CO2 in the atmosphere had a delta C13, the carbon-13 isotope ratio of -7 per mil, and a delta C14, which is how we express the amount of carbon-14 in a sample, of about 0 per mil. The CO2 that is added from combustion of fossil fuels has a delta C13 of -25 per mil and a delta C14 of -1,000 per mil. So the Zeus effect, which is called the Zeus effect because it was described first by physicist Hans Zeus, is the, who I believe was on Ellen Druffel's thesis committee, so is the decrease in delta C13 and delta C14 in atmospheric CO2 due to the addition of fossil fuel derived CO2. This has been, this does make it into the ocean, and so there is an oceanic Zeus effect too. With respect to delta C13, what I'm showing here is a graph of the concentration of CO2 from 1850 to the 2000s in the atmosphere, as well as the delta C13 of that CO2 in the atmosphere over the same time. And you can see that the changes in the atmosphere delta C13 are directly tied to changes in CO2, so that it is a good tracer of the uptake of fossil fuel CO2. These measurements all come from ice cores and from atmospheric values as well. C14 would be a really powerful tracer of the Zeus effect, except there was thermonuclear weapons testing in the late 50s, early 60s, and that essentially doubled the atmospheric inventory of carbon-14. So the big lines are the delta C14 value of the CO2 in the atmosphere, and these purple and light blue lines are the value in the surface ocean. And so you can see that there was a huge spike of CO2 that is slowly mixing into the ocean. And this only goes to 2008, but if it were to continue, you would see that both the ocean and the atmosphere are starting to decrease, although the ocean takes a lot longer for changes to occur than the atmosphere. These data are from atmospheric measurements, and the ocean data are from coral measurements in the Pacific Ocean. So I always like to say, I gave this talk to a bunch of people who were not scientists, and one of my colleagues, Bill Jenkins, suggested to me that I present radiocarbon in the ocean as a sort of a CT scan with contrast of the ocean. So basically the spike it's well understood, and it's slowly mixing into the oceans. And I also like to say there's 3 good things about the bomb spike. Nuclear weapons are not a great thing, but it ended up being a great geochemical experiment that we're still learning from. I got a career out of it, and there's the movie Dr. Strangelove, which is still one that everyone should see. Prior to the programs I'm going to talk about, there were early programs started by radiocarbon in the ocean pioneers, 3 of whom were instrumental and who have passed away this last decade. Jutta Asplund and Minzy Stiver were responsible for measurements on the GeoSex program. GeoSex is the global, geochemical ocean sections study, and TTO, transient tracers in the oceans. And GeoSex was founded by saying that as we become increasingly aware of the ocean as a source of food, a disposal area for nuclear and industrial waste products, which thankfully it hasn't really been used as, a strategic realm for national security and a controlling factor in the Earth's climatic regime, we also recognize how very little we know about the sea. So one of the things that to point out here is this big tin can is actually a water sample bottle. The amount, it's called a Girard barrel, and the amount of water you needed to make a radiocarbon measurement during these two programs was 250 liters of water. So consequently, there weren't a lot of measurements. I put this cartoon of ocean circulation here. It's mainly to show you that there are areas where there's warm surface water that cools in the northern region, northern and southern poles, and sinks and moves around and then gets brought up again and warms up. And this was a cartoon to show the elements of the deep ocean circulation system. And it's actually very good if you're studying paleoceanography, but if you want to understand the uptake of CO2 in the oceans, you need more detail. Physical oceanographers consider this a simplistic cartoon, and it does a better job of showing you what is happening, really happening in the ocean, in that the Antarctic is very important because it's one of the few places where water is brought to the surface and then gets pushed around to the rest of the oceans. Much of, but this too is nowhere near complex enough to really understand the uptake of tracers and movements of the ocean. And small scale mixing is critical to how CO2 will be taken up, but it occurs on scales that are much smaller than climate model grid scales. So we need checks on whether model parameters are accurately portraying this mixing, and whether they can, in order to have confidence that the models will be able to predict future scenarios. So the WOCE, CLIVAR, and GOSHIP programs are the result, the data are the result of massive international sampling effort. And you can see that WOCE did a huge grid, and CLIVAR and GOSHIP are targeting important areas to get a time series so that every decade we get data from certain locations. All the data are available as soon as possible, and everything, including some of the GOSHIP data, are available at this site listed here, which was most recently revised. The database was revised in 2020. If you just Google GLODAP, you will get to the site that has all the data. I did want to point out that making a radiocarbon measurement isn't all that simple either, and it requires a significant amount of work. So NOSAMS has contributed over 32,000 individual radiocarbon and delta C13 measurements of DIC in the ocean water. This represents a major effort to get sampling bottles onto the ship to collect the samples. This is a rosette of Niskin bottles where each one collects a little cylinder of water at different depths. At sea, the water is precious, and there are many people taking many samples for many measurements, and there is someone known as a water cop who makes sure that everyone follows the order in which they're supposed to be taking their samples. They're shipped to the laboratory where they can be stored for up to a couple of years before analysis. In the chemistry laboratory, the samples are acidified and sparged, and the CO2 is collected, converted to graphite, pressed into a target holder, and analyzed on the accelerator mass spectrometer, which you should be familiar with since you have one in the basement of your lab, I believe, your building. Analyzing all these samples means there's been a lot of work involved, including 15,000 hours of AMS beam time. It's important to know that the data are good. We're comparing data collected over 4 decades. And there are, for carbon-13, there are a number of laboratories conducting these analyses. And I can really only show you comparisons for C13 because there haven't been any international comparisons of the radiocarbon data. In 2001, 5 of the laboratories that were measuring delta C13, these included University of Washington, NOSAMS, some Japanese laboratories, did an informal international comparison. And in 2019, there was a more robust, a study started by Cheng at Dalhousie, where 16 labs, unfortunately not NOSAMS, participated in a comparison study. The bottom line was that there are significant offsets that need to be documented. It's not surprising that there are offsets, but they do not preclude the use of data sets for carbon cycle modeling. You can use mathematical methods such as multiple linear regressions to identify the offsets and then evaluate anthropogenic CO2 uptake and accumulation. And you can see an example of this in a paper by Paul Quay et al. So everyone is currently working to identify and document differences. As I said, I can't really tell you much about carbon-14, but I can tell you that I and 3 of my colleagues have been funded to conduct a workshop to provide the community with a document for best practices for collection, storage, and measurement of samples for carbon-13 and carbon-14. This will be happening in summer or fall of 2021, so it will almost certainly be a virtual workshop. We hope to attract lots of people making the measurements. There's also, particularly with respect to carbon-13, a number of new methods for making these measurements that need to be discussed, described, and evaluated. And then there's a couple of ways to measure carbon-14 that have changed since I set up the lab 30 years ago. So if anyone is making these measurements or know of people who should be involved in this workshop, please send me an email or send my host an email and she'll pass it on to me. But I'm just a.mcnichol@hui.edu. So that's something that I think is exciting, and I think that clearly one of the recommendations will be finding good standards, primary standards or reference materials for these measurements. And probably in the future, a round robin of comparisons amongst the laboratories. So what are we learning? I'm going to split this into the surface ocean and the deep ocean and talk primarily about the Antarctic and the Pacific. The ocean, we're finding that the bomb signal is being absorbed into the ocean and the terrestrial environment. The surface ocean C14 content is decreasing. And there are regions of the ocean that are now a source of carbon-14 to the atmosphere instead of the years when we've been seeing the atmosphere pumping carbon-14 into the ocean. And here I'm showing the data collected along 30 degrees south from Australia to Chile on a WOCE cruise line named P6, Pacific Ocean, I don't know what, it's one of the 6 lines. The data were collected from on 3 separate occupations of this line, one in 1992, one in 2003 by a Japanese laboratory, and again in 2010. So the red and the blue were measured at NOSAMS, and the white diamonds at in Japan, I believe at JAMSTEC. One thing that you can see is that over the decade, the surface ocean delta C14 is declining. There's definitely agreement amongst the between the two labs. So that's good to see that the measurements appear to be very comparable. And over 20 years, there's very significant differences. The error bars are shown here. And I think there's a little more scatter in the 1992 data, but that's probably because this is one of the first cruises that was measured as part of these programs. If you look at the rate of change of carbon-14 in the ocean surface, you can use sophisticated models with a lot of data, or in a very simple matter, you can look at this station along 30 degrees south, which has been measured as part of Geophysics in the 1970s, as part of WOCE, as part of the Japanese occupation, and as part of CLIVAR. And if you, what we're showing here is the delta C14 in the atmosphere in the red line versus year. If you just draw a line through there, you see a decline of about 2.6 per mil per year in the surface ocean. These purple circles are coral data that Alan Andrews collected and measured high resolution carbon-14 values on. This is plotted as FC14, although he's basically looking at the delta C14. You can see that there's a huge spike and then it's coming down. And his data suggests that the decline is about 2.3 per mil per year. So this is really nice confirmation of the fact that the two different methods, one looking at the carbonate in a surface core, looking at carbonate signal from corals that are reflecting the surface ocean C14 and directly measuring it in seawater, as well as the fact that these measurements were made over 10, 20, 35 years. We can look in a more detailed fashion at the change in the DIC14 of the global surface ocean. This data were put together from GLODAP by Joanna Lester, who recently defended her thesis. She's working with Heather Graven at Imperial College in London. You can see she's separated the observations into those from 1980 to 2000 and from 2000 to 2014. So this is WOCE and first CLIVAR and second CLIVAR, and probably haven't gotten into GOSHA when she put this together. But it's clear the red values are high values of delta C14 and the bluer colors are low values of delta C14. And it's clear that everywhere the signal has changed, which means it's moving, and that's because it's moving deeper into the ocean. Apparently my slide decided that I had spoken enough on that. We're going to look at delta C13 as well. Now this is work of Paul Quay's. He has made over 3,457 measurements in the surface ocean water by commandeering ships of opportunity, as well as participating in WOCE and CLIVAR cruises, and has binned his data into the 1990s and the 2000s. And here, this is, when we're looking at carbon-14, we're looking at the impact of the bomb signal. Here we're looking at the uptake of fossil fuel CO2. So CO2 that has been declining over time because of the input of light CO2. And if you look at the averages, which are, the green is the average of the 1990s. Again, this is from the Southern Ocean, minus 80 degrees latitude, to the North Pacific at 60 degrees north. The difference between the green squares and the black circles is significant. These measurements are made to about plus or minus 0.03 per mil. And this can be modeled to understand the uptake, and which can sort of be seen in this slide. This is the work of a postdoc who was working with Claret, working with Ralph Sunrup and Paul Quay at the University of Washington. And here she's looking at the modified changes in the air-sea delta C13 equilibrium over the period 1970 to 1995, as well as the accumulation of anthropogenic CO2 due to the transport of DIC-13 and DIC in the ocean interior. And the difference is showing you that anthropogenic CO2 is being moved around the ocean. So it's coming in at different places and then it gets moved around, so the signals look different. Interestingly, as a part of this study, she was applying the Princeton MOM5 model with the biogeochemistry BLING model. And to be able, before she did this work, to be able to accurately represent what she was seeing in the depth profiles in the surface ocean, she had to adjust the rate of air-sea flux of CO2. And so this is an instance where important information is being gained by using the carbon isotopes in the ocean, by the measurements and modeling them. So in the deep ocean, what are we learning? We're learning that the penetration of the bomb C14 signal is easily measurable. I believe at the beginning of WOCE, it wasn't clear how strong the signal would be. The C14 changes in the ocean are now controlled by internal ocean processes, not air-sea exchange. This is a conclusion that Heather Graven determined based on models. This means that radiocarbon is now analogous to anthropogenic CO2, and in the deep ocean, it's a powerful tracer of the how rapidly the anthropogenic CO2 is getting into the deep ocean. And she also determined that the C14 Zeus effect will again be measurable, and did some interesting, which I won't be showing, interesting work where she showed calculated the expected changes depending on the which IPCC scenario whatever path we go down, you will be able to confirm it by looking at C14 in the ocean, surface oceans. I'm going to start by showing the Southern Ocean data collected in 1992 and 2011. So these are two separate occupations of this line around Antarctica, 19 years apart. We're looking at a depth profile from 0 to 4,000 meters and looking at the delta C14, which is the high values are in the very surface. And we're looking also here at the change, the subtracting 2011 from 1992 to see where there's regions of change. I want you to note that the gradient bar here goes from -30 to +30 because it'll be different in the next slide I show. But there's not huge, there are changes, they're measurable changes, but they're not huge. And that's because this is an area where there's a lot of mixing from top to bottom, but there's also this water gets pushed out into the other oceans. And so the reason it does change is the bomb C14 is being exported northward into mode and intermediate waters. The next slide I'm going to show you has points out where the Antarctic intermediate water is. So then we can look at the Pacific Ocean going from almost Antarctica up to Alaska and look at the changes in the C14. And please note that the different slide here, so this is over 1991 to 2005, so it's like 15 years. Note that we have more than doubled the gradient slide here. There are very big changes. There's movement of C14 into the gyres, down deeper. So the major accumulation is in the subtropics, and the differences observed over 15 years are enormous with respect to the measurement error. We believe we're measuring to plus or minus 4 to 5 per mil, and we're seeing changes of up to 75 per mil, which is huge. What else did I say about this? The movement of C14 from the surface waters to the deep waters isn't a direct transfer up and down. It's actually movement of water from the Antarctic to the Pacific. And in a Jenkins et al. Paper, use the differences in the southern section here to estimate a transit time for Antarctic intermediate water from the Antarctic to this region of approximately 30 years. And sorry about that. This slide here is just, I put it in to sort of show you the challenges of sampling in polar regions. The CTD rosette has to be launched through a door and can't be launched off the deck of the ship because the water in the Niskin bottles would freeze before you could sample it when you brought the rosette back on ship. So and then I wanted to show you that these global data sets are excellent for helping model stuff. They are used to calibrate global models, but they're also useful for other studies. And I just was going to give you a slide about radiocarbon and about carbon-13. As I hope you know, Ellen Druffel has devoted a significant portion of her time into trying to understand the complicated pool of carbon known as dissolved organic carbon. And I suspect Christian Lewis will be discussing in 2 days the enigma of how old the dissolved organic carbon is, and how poorly understood that is by chemical oceanographers. But what's plotted here are deep water data from samples collected on a P16N transect in the Pacific. What we're looking at is the apparent age of the dissolved organic carbon versus latitude, and the apparent age of the dissolved inorganic carbon. And you can see, first of all, note that the DOC is much older than the DIC. But if you draw a line through, the slope of the line that you see here for DOC is very similar to the slope of the line for DOC. And what that tells you is that aging during transport is the most important process for the change in the age of DOC14 in the deep Pacific, which any information we can get about the age and the reason for the age of DOC anywhere in the ocean is a major accomplishment. So this was extremely useful to know. And in another application, which is looking at paleo tracers of, in this case, perhaps paleo CO2. Colleagues of Ann Pearson's used the delta C13 of glycerol dibiphenyl glycerol tetraether, often known as GDGTs, but I'm going to call them Archaeal lipids because that rolls off my tongue more easily. Was in the Western Atlantic off Brazil, collected at 4 sites, a number of it collected C13 and measured it in the particulate organic carbon, the dissolved inorganic carbon, the archaeal lipids, and pH and CO2. This was what they were trying to do, was test the assumption that the fractionation between the archaeal lipids and DIC is constant, which was what had been thought. And it was thought that the archaeal lipids could be used to get paleo DIC values. When their results convinced them, I guess I'm a co-author, so convinced us that it's more likely related to the in situ pH and the dissolved CO2 aqueous. This suggests that the archaeal lipids might be important in reconstructing paleo PCO2 because these membrane lipids are preserved in sediments throughout geologic time. There's some other assumptions that might make this more challenging to adopt, but it's pretty exciting thought that you could do that, and pretty exciting that you can make these measurements to the required precision as well. So I think hopefully I've given you a flavor for all the measurements that have been made at NOCIMS. I have to have a disclaimer. I am no longer formally at NOCIMS. I resigned my position there 2 years ago, but I am still radiocarb Ann, as I like to call myself. It's important. I still do radiocarbon, and I do C13 as well. And I'm hopefully spending more time looking at what the data mean rather than producing all the data. And the global measurements are documenting the impact of human activity and will continue to do so. Improving methods make it easier and easier to make these measurements, and there will be more and more of them, and they will produce more and more exciting data. And the database that exists now is understudied, and it would provide excellent opportunity for students and postdocs to conduct fascinating studies. So anyway, I wanted to thank you for your attention, and this is one of the ways this fall that I managed to beat the pandemic. So thank you.
Thank you, Anne. Let's give her a round of applause here.
Thank you.
And I have a WOCE question.
Okay.
The early east-west lines, the WOCE lines in the Pacific, none of them have radiocarbon as far as I know. Why was that? Was NOCIMS not ready, or are there a whole bunch of bottles sitting in a warehouse?
No, there are no bottles sitting in a warehouse. That means a different, gosh, I think I'd have to ask my colleague Bob Key that, because I got into actually writing the proposals for the sample collection when CLIVAR rolled around. So that proposal was written before I got into that part of it. So, but and it's actually a little depressing if you, not depressing, but if you look at the, this was actually just a problem for me. And another interesting thing is that in the early days of WOCE, it was not considered that accelerator mass spectrometry had the precision necessary for providing results for the deep ocean. And so those were made by large volume measurements, which means that they are more sparse than the surface data.
Are there other questions? Please just speak up.
Hi, I had a question there. Great talk, by the way. So with regards to the ocean now being a source of C13 in the atmosphere. I think I might have missed it. Was that primarily because of increased outgassing, or is that the fact that the ocean now just the CO2 that's already coming out had more C13 in the atmosphere?
So actually, it's C14, but it's because so much of the bomb signal has moved into the ocean that the ocean has more carbon-14, so the gradient favors the transfer of C14 to the atmosphere, not necessarily CO2, but C14. So, C14O2.
Thank you.
The isotopes are so CO2 equilibrates with the atmosphere in about a year, but the isotopes take 10 years to equilibrate with the atmosphere. So there's very different time scales.
A question?
Mhm.
Yeah, at one point you mentioned a study done with the MOM5 model. Where
Right.
they were analyzing radiocarbon data, I think it was, where they had to modify the air-sea gas exchange. Did I get that
That was
right?
actually C13, yeah.
13. Oh, okay, okay. And do you know which way the sign went? Was it a difference over the standard Wanikoff parameterization? Or
You know, I did know that, but I think they had to slow it down, but I'm not sure. The paper is in revision, so it should be coming out soon.
Okay, I'll look out for it. Thank you.
By Claret, C-L-A-R-E-T. So.
Thank you.
People had reduced that anyway, right? Maybe 10 years ago. So a bunch of papers came out.
Right. Yeah, I think it's even a little different. So, but.
Yeah, that's reduced from Wanikoff.
Yeah. Yeah, but I think what they were using in MOM 5 had been, I assume it had been modified 10 years ago.
Are there any other questions for Anne? Okay, well, let's thank her again.
Well, thank you for listening.